It was past midnight when my phone rang, and at first I almost ignored it, thinking it was one of those wrong numbers that disturb the peace of the night. But when I picked it up and heard my grandson's trembling whisper saying, "Please, Grandma, don't go home tonight, just trust me," my heart froze in my chest, because the fear in his voice told me this was no ordinary call. This was the beginning of something that would break me in ways I never thought possible. Thank you so much for watching and giving me a little of your time. It means more than I can ever put into words. And before I go on, I would love to know where you are watching from. So please tell me in the comments. Because that night, as I held the phone close to my ear, I could feel my hands shaking and my heart racing faster than it ever had before. And even though I wanted to ask questions, to demand answers, I knew from the way his voice cracked that he was protecting me from something I was not ready to hear. And in that moment, the room felt colder, the silence heavier, and I sat there staring into the dark with nothing but his words echoing in my mind, wondering what danger could possibly be waiting for me at my own home. I sat there on the edge of the bed, staring at the dim light from the hotel lamp, trying to understand how my life had come to this moment. And as I waited with my heart pounding, I thought back to the years that had shaped me. The years when I worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. The sacrifices that carved lines into my face, but gave me the pride of knowing my son had every chance to grow into a good man. I remembered the nights I stayed awake sewing clothes by hand. The mornings I walked through rain and snow to catch the early bus, all so he could eat breakfast before school and never know the emptiness I felt as a girl growing up with nothing. And for so long, I believed my struggles had built something strong, something unbreakable. Because when I looked at him as a boy, with his eager smile and endless questions, I thought to myself that he would one day be the one to lift me up when my knees grew weak. I thought he would be my reward after all the years of hardship. Yet as I sat there listening to my grandson's words echo in my ear, I realized how blind love can be. Because behind the pride I carried, there were cracks I refused to see. Nights when he stayed out too late, mornings when he came home with excuses that never sounded right, friends who slipped away when I walked into the room. And though my heart told me to question it, I kept pushing those doubts away, telling myself he was just under pressure, that life was harder for him than I understood. But deep down, I knew something was shifting, something I did not want to face. And now, with one phone call, my grandson was asking me to open my eyes, to accept that the boy I raised was no longer the man I thought I knew. And the weight of that truth pressed down on me so heavily that I could hardly breathe. Because in that quiet hotel room, the memories of love, sacrifice, and hope collided with the fear that everything I believed in was about to collapse. I kept thinking about the years when I first noticed the changes in him. The little things that seemed harmless at first but grew heavier over time. How he once came home with that spark in his eyes when he got his first job and told me he was going to make me proud. And I believed every word because I wanted to believe. Yet slowly, the spark turned into shadows and excuses. He would tell me he was working late, but his clothes smelled of smoke and his voice carried the edge of anger that was never there before. I remember setting dinner on the table and waiting for him to join me, only to hear the front door slam and his footsteps fade into the night. I remember asking if everything was all right, and he would snap back. I said, "I'm fine. Stop worrying so much." And I would force a smile, swallow my words, and pretend it was just stress. Because what mother wants to imagine her own son drifting into a life that could break everything she worked for? And as the months went by, the distance between us grew wider, even though we lived under the same roof. His friends came and went, with whispers in the hallway and hurried glances when they saw me watching. Sometimes I would find money tucked into places that made no sense. And when I asked, he would brush it off with a careless laugh and say he was saving for something big. I wanted to trust him. But deep down, a part of me knew, trust without truth is nothing but denial. And denial became my daily companion. I let the warning signs pass because I thought love was enough to protect him. I thought my sacrifices would shield him from darkness. But love cannot close your eyes when the truth is standing in front of you. And still I tried. I kept cooking his favorite meals, hoping he would sit with me like he used to. I kept ironing his shirts, hoping he would see that no matter what, I was here. But the more I gave, the more he pulled away. And now, sitting in that hotel room, remembering those moments, I could feel the sting of every ignored sign. Every time I chose silence instead of hard questions. Every time I told myself he was just tired. Because all those little moments were leading me to this night. This moment when my grandson's trembling voice forced me to see what I had refused to face. And the pain of that realization was almost unbearable. Knowing that the child I had raised with so much love had grown into a man with secrets heavy enough to summon sirens in the night, heavy enough to put my very home under the eyes of the police. And as my thoughts raced, I could hear my grandson's whisper repeating in my ear, "Please don't go home tonight. Please just trust me." And I realized that the boy who once needed my protection was now the one protecting me. And the son who once held my hand and promised he would never hurt me had become the source of my deepest wound. And in that truth, I felt a mix of sorrow, anger, and fear, so sharp it carved into my chest, leaving me to wonder how I could have been so blind, for so long. As I sat there with my mind drowning in those memories, I could not help but think of my grandson. The boy who carried more weight on his young shoulders than he ever should have. Because I started to see the signs that he had been living in fear for longer than I realized. The way his eyes darted toward the door whenever his father's footsteps echoed through the house. The way his voice lowered when he asked me simple questions, as if someone might overhear. And the way he clung to me a little tighter whenever I hugged him goodbye. And at the time, I thought it was just the tenderness of youth. But now I know it was his silent cry for safety. His desperate way of asking me to notice what he did not yet have the words to say. I remember one night when he sat at the kitchen table, tracing circles on the wooden surface with his finger. His face pale, his lips pressed tight, and then he looked up at me and asked in a voice so fragile, "Do you think Dad loves us the way we love him?" And my heart cracked at that question. But I forced a smile and told him of course he does. He is just tired, he is just busy. But deep inside I felt the same ache he did. Because love should never make a child wonder if it is real. And I pushed it away, just as I pushed away every doubt that crept into my chest. And now as I think of it, I see how he had been watching, how he had been carrying secrets far too heavy for his age. And while I chose silence, he chose courage. While I denied what was happening, he prepared himself to face it. And that phone call in the middle of the night was not the first time he had tried to warn me. It was the moment he could no longer carry the burden alone. And I realize now that every glance, every whispered question, every tremor in his voice had been leading us to this point. Where he finally begged me not to go home because he loved me too much to let me walk into the truth unprepared. And the thought of that pierced through me. Because while my son was hiding lies inside my very walls, it was my grandson who held on to the truth. And though it broke his heart to reveal it, he chose me over blood. He chose to save me when I could not save myself. And that is a kind of bravery that will forever humble me. Because it reminded me that even in the darkest moments, there can still be a light strong enough to break through. When the phone finally went silent, and I was left staring into the stillness of that night, I felt my whole body trembling, because the words of my grandson would not leave me. They circled through my mind like a warning bell that would not stop ringing, and even though every part of me wanted to believe that maybe it was a mistake, maybe he was just scared of something small, the sound of his voice told me otherwise. His whisper carried a truth too heavy for a child to invent, and as I sat there, I thought about how many times I had dismissed those subtle warnings. How many times I had told myself that love could cover cracks. And now, here I was faced with a fear I could no longer push away. Because the silence outside my hotel window was broken by the faint hum of engines. And then came the distant wail of sirens, low at first but growing louder, rolling through the streets until it felt like the whole city had been shaken awake. I rose to my feet, clutching the curtain with trembling fingers. and when I pulled it back, I saw the glow of red and blue lights dancing across the walls, flashing against the glass in violent waves. My heart hammered as I pressed my forehead to the cold window. And in that moment I realized the warning was not about something that might happen. It was already happening. The sound of tires screeching, the sharp bark of dogs carried through the night air, and the shadows of officers moving with urgency painted themselves across the street below. I could barely breathe as the truth settled into me. My home, the place I had poured my life into, was surrounded. And though I could not yet see who they were after, I knew in my bones that the moment had come when everything I had tried to hide from myself would stand exposed under those flashing lights. And I whispered to myself over and over, "Please let this not be true. Please let my grandson be wrong." But the pounding in my chest told me the truth was already at my doorstep. I stood frozen by that window, staring down at the scene that was unfolding like some nightmare I could not wake from. Because the quiet street I had walked for decades, the place where I had planted flowers in the spring and shoveled snow in the winter, was now lit up like a battlefield. 17 police cars lined up in both directions with their lights piercing the night, the sound of doors slamming shut as officers poured out in full gear. Their voices sharp and commanding, dogs straining at their leashes, and neighbors peeking from their windows with wide eyes, whispering into the darkness as if the whole world had suddenly turned against the house I had once called safe. And I pressed my hand against the glass and whispered, "That is my home, my heart, my years. How can this be happening?" And then I saw them move toward the back. Shining their flashlights over the garden I once tended with my son when he was small, I remembered how his little hands would drop seeds into the soil while I covered them gently and told him that patience makes everything grow. And now that same earth was being torn apart by boots and beams of light, as if the life we had built there meant nothing. And my breath caught when the back door burst open and officers disappeared inside. Because I knew then that they were not searching for a stranger. They had come for someone I loved. Someone whose footsteps I knew as well as my own heartbeat, and the weight of it almost brought me to my knees. I clutched the curtain tighter, praying, pleading, begging for it not to be him, not to be my son. But deep in my soul, I knew the truth had been walking toward me for years. Every denial, every excuse, every night I sat waiting at the table with a plate of food gone cold, had been leading to this. And as the minutes dragged on, the sound of chaos inside grew louder. Drawers being pulled, cabinets broken open, muffled shouts bouncing off the walls that once held our laughter. And then I saw movement. 2 officers pushing through the doorway, and between them was a man whose head hung low, his hands cuffed behind his back, and the sight ripped through me with a pain so sharp I could not breathe. Because under the harsh lights and the heavy shadows, it was him, my son, the boy I once carried in my arms, the boy I once sang to sleep, the man I had defended to everyone even when my own heart questioned him, now being dragged out of the very house I had built for him, his face hidden, but his silence louder than any denial. And I pressed my hand to my chest and felt it breaking, because I was watching not just the arrest of my son, but the shattering of every hope, every dream, every sacrifice I had ever made. And the truth that I had ignored for so long finally stood before me, undeniable and merciless, leaving me in the glow of those flashing lights, with nothing but sorrow and shame, heavy enough to crush me. I could not move as I watched them lead him away. My feet felt like they were nailed to the floor, my heart pounding so loudly I thought the whole world could hear it. Because there in front of everyone, in front of neighbors who had waved to me for years, stood my son with his wrists bound, his head lowered, his shoulders slumped, as if every lie he had ever told finally weighed him down, and the sound of those handcuffs clicking shut was like a hammer striking the last nail into the coffin of the man I thought I knew. I pressed my trembling fingers to my lips as tears blurred my eyes, and all I could think of was how many times I had defended him, how many times I told myself he was just tired, just unlucky, just misunderstood, when deep down I knew I was covering wounds that were never going to heal. I thought of the times I told neighbors not to judge him, the times I told my grandson to respect his father no matter what. and the bitter taste of regret filled my mouth. Because what respect was left when a man used his own mother's house as a hiding place for his crimes, when he turned the walls I had worked my life to build into a cage of secrets? And as the police pushed him into the back of the car, I felt as if the whole world was watching me, judging me, whispering about how I must have known, how I must have seen, and though they did not say it aloud, I could feel it in their eyes. That shame settled deep inside me like a stone. Because love blinded me, and now there was no hiding from the truth. My son was not just troubled, he was guilty, and everything I had tried to protect collapsed under the weight of those flashing lights. And in that moment, I wanted to scream, to run, to beg them to let me speak to him. But my voice refused to come out, leaving me in silence as the door of the police car slammed shut. And the reality of my life was changed forever. As the police cars lined the street, and the weight of what I had just seen crushed me from the inside, one of the officers finally approached and spoke to me in a voice that tried to be calm, but carried the heaviness of truth. He told me that my house had been under surveillance for nearly 2 years, that every corner of the home I had built with my own hands had been studied, that men had watched from cars parked in the shadows while I watered my flowers and waved at neighbors. And all the while they were not watching me, they were watching him, my son, because he had turned the place I called sacred into a front for his crimes. They said drugs had been stored under the floorboards I once polished on my knees. Pills hidden in false cabinets that I had dusted every morning. Packages passed through hands while I sat knitting in the living room thinking life was ordinary. And hearing those words felt like knives twisting deeper with each sentence. I shook my head over and over, whispering that it could not be true, that my son would never drag his own mother's house into the dirt. But the officer's eyes told me there was no mistake, no doubt, no escape. And when he said it had all been confirmed with evidence, my legs nearly gave out beneath me. I thought of the nights I had smelled strange odors but told myself it was nothing. The times I heard footsteps in the basement when he swore he was not home. The way he avoided my questions with charm that I mistook for exhaustion. And the guilt swallowed me whole, because I had chosen to ignore every piece of the puzzle until it formed a picture too big to deny. I wanted to scream at the heavens and ask why the boy I raised with love and sacrifice had chosen to betray not just the law, but me, the mother who gave him everything. And yet the bitter answer was already there. It was greed, it was lies, it was weakness. And in that moment, I saw my life split into 2 pieces. The years before this night when I believed in him, and the years that would follow where I would live with the truth of what he had done. And my heart broke, not only for him, but for myself, because everything inside that home had been touched by his deception. And I could never walk through those rooms again without seeing the shadows of his crimes etched into the walls. And as the officer's words faded into the night, I stood there with tears streaming down my face, realizing that love had blinded me for too long, and now love was the very thing that made this betrayal cut so deeply, leaving me hollow, broken, and ashamed under the glow of those flashing lights that would forever mark the night my world fell apart. When the officers stepped back and left me standing alone with the truth, I felt the world closing in on me, because all I could think about was the last time I had spoken to him, the way he had looked at me with those tired eyes, and told me everything was fine, told me I worried too much, told me to stop digging into things I did not understand. And I remember nodding, even though a storm was rising in my chest, because I wanted to believe him so badly. I wanted to believe that my son, the boy I had held in my arms, the boy whose scraped knees I once kissed, and whose dreams I once encouraged, could not be the kind of man who would bring shame into my home. But standing there with the echo of the handcuffs still in my ears, I realized every word he had spoken to me in those final days had been rehearsed lies, carefully wrapped in charm, given to me like poison disguised as comfort. And my heart broke in a way I cannot describe, because the betrayal of a stranger is painful, but the betrayal of your own blood is like being cut open from the inside, where no one can see the wound. I thought of the dinners I had cooked where he barely touched his plate, The phone calls he took in whispers as he walked into the other room. The sudden bursts of anger when I asked simple questions. And I thought of how I had dismissed it all, telling myself that life was hard for him, that maybe he was stressed, that maybe the world had been unkind to him. But the truth was that he had built a wall of secrets around himself, and I had been standing on the other side, knocking softly, hoping one day he would let me back in. And instead, he had chosen to build his empire of lies within the very walls I had worked my life to protect, using me as a cover, using my trust as his shield. And when I realized this, I felt a sickness rise through me. Because I understood that he had not only betrayed the law, he had betrayed me. And he had betrayed the boy who called me at midnight with trembling lips, begging me not to go home, the boy who still believed that love meant protection. I closed my eyes and saw my grandson's face, the way his voice cracked when he whispered, "Please, Grandma, trust me," and in that moment I understood the weight he had carried in silence, watching his father sink deeper while I refused to see. And my heart ached for him even more than it ached for myself, because he had been forced to grow up too soon, to choose between loyalty to his father and safety for me. And he had chosen the harder path, the one that no child should have to take. And I felt both sorrow and pride. Sorrow that he had been placed in such a cruel position, and pride that he had the strength to save me when I could not save myself. And that realization tore me open, because the son I had raised with my sweat and tears had used me. But the grandson I thought I was protecting was the one who had been protecting me all along. As the night stretched on and the police continued their work, I felt the memories of my life crash against me in waves. The laughter in that home, the birthdays celebrated, the holidays where we gathered around the table, all of it stained now by the knowledge of what had been hidden under the floorboards. And I whispered to myself that nothing would ever be the same. Because trust once broken is a wound that never fully heals. And yet within that pain a new truth was born. The truth that sometimes courage skips a generation. That sometimes the strength you pray to find in your children is instead found in the grandchildren who watch in silence. And though the betrayal shattered me, the bravery of that midnight call became the light that guided me through the darkness of that night, reminding me that while one bond had been destroyed, another had been made unbreakable. When the lights finally began to fade and the street slowly emptied of the chaos that had filled it, I felt an emptiness inside me that words cannot describe, because I was left with the silence of knowing that the home I had poured my heart into was no longer just mine. It was a place marked by betrayal, a place where lies had lived beneath the very floor I once scrubbed with my hands. And I sat in that silence thinking of my grandson, thinking of the courage it must have taken for him to dial that number, to make that call that no young soul should ever have to make. And I imagined how heavy his heart must have been carrying a secret that could destroy his own father. And the thought of it broke me and healed me all at once. Because while I wept for the son I lost, I felt pride rising for the grandson who saved me. I thought about how he had watched quietly, gathering the strength that I did not see in myself. How he had chosen truth when everyone else was drowning in denial. And I knew that from that night forward, my duty was no longer to grieve for what was gone, but to protect what remained. To give him a life free from the shadows that had taken over his father. And though shame clung to me like a weight, I also felt a spark of resolve. Because betrayal may break your heart, but it also teaches you who is truly by your side. And I whispered through my tears that no matter what happens next, nor how many whispers follow our name, I will stand for him. I will fight for him, and I will never let his courage be in vain. In the days that followed, I found myself sitting in quiet places, replaying every word, every look, every moment that had led us here. And I could feel the ache of betrayal lingering like a shadow that refused to leave. Yet in the middle of that ache, there was a strength I had not felt in years. Because when everything is stripped away and the truth stands in front of you, there is no room left for denial. Only the choice to rise or to fall. And I chose to rise for the sake of my grandson. For the boy who had carried the weight of honesty when I was too blinded by love to see clearly. I remembered how his voice trembled that night, how he begged me not to go home. And I realized that his bravery had saved me not just from danger, but from myself. Because if I had gone back and walked into that house unaware, I might have been crushed by the sight of my own son's downfall without the chance to prepare my heart. And so I began to tell myself that though blood may betray, courage can still be found in the next branch of the family tree. I told myself that love is not measured by words but by actions. And his actions spoke louder than anything I had ever known. He chose me, he chose safety, he chose truth. And that choice gave me a reason to hold my head high, even as whispers of shame surrounded me. And as I looked into his eyes in those quiet mornings after, I saw not just the reflection of pain but the reflection of hope. A hope that life could still be rebuilt. That trust could still live between us. And that even though my heart had been shattered by one I loved, it was held together by another who loved me enough to protect me when I could not protect myself. And as I sit here now sharing this with you, I know my life will never be the same. Because the son I once trusted broke me in ways I never imagined. Yet the grandson I thought I was protecting became the one who protected me. And though the pain still lingers like a scar across my heart, I have learned that courage and truth will always shine brighter than lies. I have learned that sometimes love means making the hardest choice, and I hold on to that lesson with everything I have left, because it reminds me that even in betrayal, there can be strength. Even in sorrow, there can be hope. And even in the darkest nights, a voice can still rise and save you. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. It means more than I can ever say. Please don't forget to subscribe so you can be here with me again. And share this story with someone who may need to hear it.